For 14 laps, Carlos Sainz and the Ferrari led the Italian Grand Prix from the pole. The crowd couldn't believe it. They expected a win, but it didn't happen. The fairy tale didn't come true on this occasion, from a Ferrari Italian perspective, I guess. The win went to Max Verstappen, who, if you please, has now won 10 Grand Prix in a row. First time that's ever happened in Formula One, breaking the record set by another Red Bull driver, Sebastian Vettel. 9 straight wins for Sebastian. But Max has now scored 10 in a row, and he did so in a very typical, very professional Max Verstappen Red Bull type afternoon. Qualified on the front row, P2, good start, settled into P2 at the start of the race, put quite a lot of pressure on Carlos Sainz, but twigged very early that it was going to be difficult to pass Sainz because of all the things we were talking about in this video yesterday, the top speed advantage that Ferrari took into this race, and it showed over the Red Bull, and Max was acknowledging that in the early laps of the race. And I didn't predict, I guess I was kind of hoping that, just for the sake of having a little bit of change, I guess I was kind of hoping that with that top speed advantage and with the speed that Ferrari had shown with a heavy fuel load on Friday and on Saturday, that Carlos was going to have enough room to play with to manage the tyres. The problem today was that Max was just too near. He was never in a position really to look after the tyres, and Carlos Sainz that is, because Max Verstappen was always in his mirrors. And that's what won Max the race today. He quite quickly, very early on in the race, pushed Carlos into a position where he couldn't really do any tyre management, and all he could do was sort of look in his mirrors and try to defend from about 6 laps onwards, albeit with that top speed advantage. And as I say, Red Bull did get on the radio to Max at some point and said, look, rear tyres are going off, Max, let's make a move. And Max replied, yeah, but this thing is really quick in a straight line, as we said yesterday. And I thought the impressive thing was how Max then thought that through. This is where the engineers are on the pit wall, they're doing their thing, and it's kind of up to the driver. Don't take any risks, Max, etc., etc. And Max realized very early on, I think, that it was difficult. It was going to be really difficult, even though he was getting held up now, to pass Carlos Sainz in the DRS, with the help of DRS on the pit straight, because all he could really do was pull out just before the braking area, at which point Carlos was always going to go down the inside, and it was always going to be a dodgy move, a dodgy pass. And to get the real pass, he needed to be able to pull out earlier, and he didn't have enough top speed to do that. That was the interesting thing. That's why I think Carlos led for the first 14 laps of the Italian Grand Prix. It wasn't 6 laps or 3 laps, it was 14 laps, which is quite impressive, even though they went very quickly, as races always do at Monza. So what Max did, and this is the sign of Max's maturity, the way he thinks through a race, and this is not what Sergio Perez did, got to say in brackets. What Max did was realise that the real pass at Monza is going to be made into the second chicane if he can be on the outside on the run through out of the chicane and then through the Curva Grande, the long right-hander, flat-out right-hander, towards the second chicane. If he was on the inside there and more or less alongside Carlos, then he was going to be on the grip under braking, and then he was going to get the lead into that second chicane. It wasn't a DRS area. It was just a place where it was logical to try and pass. So his main hope, obviously, was that Carlos would make some sort of error, so would lock up, would run a little bit wide at turn 1, maybe even go down the escape road. So what Max did over the next 2 or 3 laps was brake really late, as late as he dared. He just sat there right behind Carlos, sometimes to the left, sometimes alongside him going into the first chicane, to the point where eventually Carlos, yes, did lock up. It was about the one and only time he did lock up in the race, but he locked up. And to his credit, I've got to say, Carlos didn't then run wide, didn't have a moment. He just locked up. He came out of the brake pedal, got it really nice, got back onto the line very, very well. But he was a little bit late on the power in doing so out of 2. And as Max had planned, coming out of 2, he was then able to just pull to the left on acceleration because he had a better acceleration run. And that put him on the outside through the Curva Grande and thus on the inside into the second chicane. And from then on, he pulled away. He didn't pull away a second a lap as we've seen other drivers in other situations. He pulled away in classic Max Verstappen style. 0.1 here, 0.2 there, 0.4 there, 0.1 here. And so it grew. And he was then able to run his race basically as he wanted to come in for hard tyres, switching from the medium to the hard, exactly on schedule, and then to go on and win the Grand Prix without really any issues whatsoever. A brilliant drive. Brilliant in the sense that he did everything correctly. He wasn't on the pole. He got the lead in difficult circumstances. And he won 10 races in a row. And that pressure, regardless of how cool Max is after the race, that pressure must build up at some point. I suppose it must. I mean, he seems to have the perfect mentality, the perfect approach to this business of Formula One racing. But 10 wins in a row. Wow. And now having got through that barrier, it'll be, oh, well, done that. Yeah, we'll just keep going now. No more pressure at all. Let's keep going. 11, 12, whatever. It was eventually a 1-2 for Red Bull because Sergio Perez, after a pretty disappointing qualifying session, utilised all the good things about that car, eventually to finish second. But he made very heavy weather of getting past Carlos Sainz, unlike Max. Well, Charles Leclerc and then Carlos Sainz. Because he never really twigged that the way to pass was into the second chicane. He was always trying that business of, well, I've got the DRS here, I've got the run on him, I hope I can get down the inside into one and I've got the pass. But he was never pulling out early enough to do that. He was never close enough to pull out early enough to do that until eventually Carlos got a little bit of an issue coming out of the parabolica, lost a bit of time. Perez on that lap got a lot closer, and eventually he got him into one relatively easy pass in the end. So yeah, a good P2 for Sergio Perez, about, well, exactly what Red Bull would want from their other driver. Won't call him the second driver. The Mexican Grand Prix is coming up soon. Their other driver did a very good job, and for Red Bull to finish 1-2 again, really impressive performance. Adrian Newey, take a bow. Max, take a bow. Christian Horner, take a bow. And Red Bull, you know, everything at Red Bull. Dietrich Mateschitz sadly no longer with us. Everybody at Red Bull should feel very, very pleased with what happened today. And after all that, the next big question was whether Carlos would then be rewarded with at least a place on the podium, a P3 finish, because Charles Leclerc was right behind him virtually for the whole race. And of course, in the closing laps, with no Red Bulls to worry about, it was a straight race between those two Ferrari drivers. And although Carlos had the track position, of course, Charles Leclerc had the DRS. And around Monza, that's a big thing. And so there were a lot of occasions when Charles was pushing Carlos up to the point where potentially he could have locked up, potentially could have had a moment. As it happened, it was Charles that actually had a moment locking up, possibly watching Carlos and not the track in front of him going into turn one. And the radio message, I think, ultimately came from Freddie Vasseur to say, take no risks, Charles, let's just bring these two cars home. And Carlos had sort of initiated that by saying, come on, guys, let's just bring these two cars into the Parc Fermé without any damage. And that's eventually what happened. So very good 3-4 for Ferrari. Best result they've had for a long time. The first time that I think the team has looked really good in all departments. All credit to Freddie Vasseur there, finally, to get it all together. A lot of full tank running. And it didn't do enough to prevent the tyre deg that they had in those, well, after about 10, 12 laps when it got really bad. But it wasn't 6 laps and it wasn't 3 laps, and they did lead for 14 laps, and they did finish 3rd and 4th ahead of the two Mercedes. George Russell soundly beat Lewis Hamilton, as he would really, he was always going to from the way they started on the grid. Lewis did not have a great qualifying, and also Lewis started on the hard tyre instead of the medium, putting the two on different strategies. Yeah, why not split the strategies? A fairly enterprising move by Mercedes, given where they were. Not much to lose, let's put it that way. And George Russell, from where he was, P4 on the grid, drove really well, ahead of Sergio Perez for the first phase of the race, doing really well. At one point, he was told, quite early on, he was told to start managing the left rear going through the first Lesmo. And George got back on the radio, quite appropriately, I thought, to say, in case you haven't watched, or in case you're not watching, I haven't got a bloke right in my mirrors at the moment, Sergio Perez. And he did very well. And there was George calling for an undercut, an early pit stop. And yeah, you know, he drove the maximum from that car, I would say. They were not quick in a straight line, as we said yesterday, but they made up for it with some good pace through the parabolica, good pace through the Ascari chicane before the parabolica. And Lewis, for his part, did pretty well. Odd to have to be saying this, but did pretty well to beat Lando Norris in the McLaren Mercedes, and then Alex Albon in the later stages of the race in the Williams Mercedes. And Alex beat Lando. Williams beat McLaren. So the two Mercedes customer teams looking really strong, but it was all pretty tense for most of the race in that crowd. Lewis, however, did have an issue with Oscar Piastri, who was very, very good, I thought, in the other McLaren. He was ahead of Lando in the early laps, capitalising on his grid position. Lando quite early on saying, we got to pick up the pace, tell Oscar to go a bit quicker. But then he would say that, wouldn't he? This is not an anti-Lando thing, but he would say that because of everything I've been saying about Oscar's presence in the McLaren team. This guy is good. He's really good. And when the pit stops began, Oscar Piastri, and this wasn't just because everybody else came in, it was because he'd been doing a very good job and was running high midfield. Oscar Piastri led the Italian Grand Prix officially only for 1 lap, but in reality it was 2 laps because he took the lead just after the start-finish line of the previous lap and then led 2 laps at the Italian Grand Prix. Then he came in and Lewis Hamilton took the lead. But it wasn't an easy thing. Temporarily took the lead, that is, but it wasn't an easy thing for Lewis to be racing with Oscar Piastri. And there was one moment when Lewis tried to go down the inside into 1, and Oscar just did a really good job under braking, and sorry Lewis, no way in the world. Then going towards the second chicane, Lewis was on the outside going through the Curva Grande, Max Verstappen style, and was on the groove, the racing groove, going to the second chicane. So it was pretty clear the corner was his. But I think Oscar probably surprised Lewis by how late he was going to brake on the marbles. He didn't overdo it, he didn't lock up, but he was there braking late. And Lewis did one of these flare things going into the second chicane. He sort of went slightly to the right and hit Oscar, who then took the escape road correctly, had to come in for a new nose, broke the front wing on the McLaren. And Lewis got a 5-second penalty for that. Piastri, for his part, with a new set of mediums on the car and with that front wing, set fastest lap of the race. So is Oscar Piastri, in his rookie season, leading Lando, out-qualifying Lando at Monza. I'm just talking about Monza this weekend. Out-qualifying Lando at Monza, leading the race, and set fastest lap. Not bad. And Alex Albon, for his part, beat Lando Norris to the finish. So the Williams Mercedes beat the McLaren Mercedes. I wonder what Zach Brown would have said if at the start of the year you'd said, for sure Williams are going to blow you away at Monza. He would have said, yeah, right, man. And he did. Alex Albon was there all day, making it very tough for drivers like Lewis, and beat Lando. Really, really impressive. And we've seen now Williams going well in qualifying, and now for the second race in a row, Zandvoort 2, they were right there. Fernando Alonso was 9th in the Aston Martin. I'm sure the press release afterwards will say, today we got the maximum from the car. He was reasonably quick in a straight line, as I said yesterday, but they just didn't seem to have the overall aero efficiency to match any sort of top speed advantage. So Fernando was kind of unnoticed in P9 for a change. That doesn't happen very often in the life of Fernando Alonso. And P10, good drive from where he was on the grid, Valtteri Bottas in the rather luridly liveried Alfa Romeo. Normally it's a lovely red, Alfa Romeo red, Formula One racing red, and this weekend they had all sorts of stripes all over it, basically Italian coloured stripes all over it to celebrate the launch of a new Stradale 33 Alfa road car. But it was a bit of a dog's dinner of a livery, I thought. That's just my opinion. But anyway, good to see Valtteri P10 for Alfa Romeo. And Oscar Piastri recovered to finish 11th, just ahead of Lawson Lawson, who also did a very good job, again, standing in for Daniel Ricciardo in the AlphaTauri. And so that was Monza. It wasn't the 1988 repeat about which we spoke yesterday, Gerhard Berger and Michele Alboreto finishing 1-2 for Ferrari, breaking that McLaren Honda stranglehold. No, this was yet another example of the job that Red Bull and Max and Adrian Newey are doing in Formula One right now. Just unbeatable. Backed up by Sergio Perez in the other car. But Ferrari P3, P4, and the crowd loved it. It was almost as if they'd won that Grand Prix. The crowd invasion, the atmosphere afterwards, almost. Not quite, but almost. And it was fun to watch. So with that, a big thanks to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.io. You can see links to both those great companies in the description below this video. And good to see on the grid Sir Jackie Stewart being presented with a memento from that classic 73 World Championship that he clinched at Monza 50 years ago. Stefano Domenicali presenting that to Sir Jackie on the grid. And I interviewed Jackie, chatted to him about that Tuesday of this week, and that video is also linked in the description below this video. I counsel you to watch it because he comes over extremely well, as ever, as Sir Jackie always does. So next race, Singapore. I'll actually be in Singapore, so the videos will be slightly different. Probably won't have quite as much data because it's going to be quite difficult getting all that together on the road, as it were. But nonetheless, looking forward to that. But in the meantime, I'll be doing some live streams, so please join us for those. Heads up, I'll give you a couple of days' notice if I can. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.